You need to focus and stop disrupting the class. This behavior is unacceptable.
You are using AI. She was waiting for me to flinch. She was waiting for the shame, the stuttered apology.
The single sheet of paper landed on the laminate faux wood desk with a sound that was less of a thud and more of a slap. A sharp, flat noise that cut through the low hum of 25 other students shifting in their plastic chairs. I did not look up immediately. I looked at the paper first. It was my essay on the socio-political implications of algorithmic bias, a topic I had chosen with a specific irony that was now apparently lost on the woman standing over me. There was no grade in the top right corner. There was only a number written in thick, aggressive red marker. 99%. Below it, in handwriting that jagged across the page like a seismograph reading a tremor, was a single word underlined twice. Plagiarized. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that has mass and density, sucking the oxygen out of the room until the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the analog clock above the whiteboard and the shallow, controlled breathing of Mrs. Vanderwall. She was waiting for me to flinch. She was waiting for the shame, the stuttered apology, the sudden drop of the head that signals guilt. I kept my hands folded on the desk, right next to the marked-up page. My fingernails were trimmed short. My posture was deliberate. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I knew from years of training by my father that my face had to remain a mask of absolute, impenetrable calm. This was the game. This was always the game. Mrs. Vanderwall tapped her index finger on the red number, her nail clicking against the desk. "Marcus," she said, and her voice was dangerously soft, a whisper meant to carry to the back of the room without technically being a shout. "We need to talk about integrity." I finally lifted my head. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pallor on her skin. She looked tired. Not just physically exhausted, but spiritually weary. The look of a person who has decided that the world is too complex to understand and has therefore decided to simplify it by force. She was looking at me, but she was not seeing me. She was seeing a statistic. She was seeing a silhouette. She was seeing a disruption to the orderly flow of her curriculum. I met her gaze. I did not blink. I did not frown. I asked her simply, "What seems to be the problem, Mrs. Vanderwall?" The question seemed to agitate her further. Her cheeks flushed a blotchy pink. "The problem," she hissed, leaning in closer so that I could smell the stale coffee on her breath, "is that I know you didn't write this. The vocabulary, the sentence structure, the syntax, it is flagged. 99% AI probability." I ran the detector 3 times. I looked back down at the essay. I remembered writing it. I remembered the texture of the keyboard under my fingers at 2 in the morning. I remembered the blue light of the monitor reflecting in the window of my bedroom while the rest of the neighborhood slept. I remembered struggling with the 3rd paragraph, deleting it and rewriting it until the cadence felt like music, until the logic flowed like a river rather than a dripping faucet. I remembered the joy of it. The specific, quiet joy of creation. And now, this woman, whose understanding of technology was limited to resetting her password and struggling with the HDMI cable, was telling me that my mind did not exist. She was telling me that the complexity of my thought process was a computational impossibility for someone who looked like me. It was not just an accusation of cheating. It was a denial of my humanity. It was a claim that my intelligence was artificial because natural intelligence in a black boy from this zip code was, to her, a statistical error. She straightened up, crossing her arms over her chest, creating a physical barrier between us. "I want you to admit it," she said, her voice rising now, gaining the confidence of a prosecutor who believes they have found the smoking gun. "You used a chatbot. You typed in the prompt, you copied the output, and you pasted it into a document. You didn't even bother to change the advanced vocabulary words. Systemic recursive loops? Epistemological framing? Come on, Marcus. Be real. Who are you trying to fool?" The class was watching now. I could feel their eyes on the back of my neck. I could feel the mixture of pity and curiosity. Some of them were probably relieved that the spotlight wasn't on them. Others, the ones who sat in the front row and always had their homework done a week in advance, looked at me with a smug satisfaction, as if the natural order of the hierarchy had been restored. Marcus is smart, they were thinking, but he isn't that smart. I took a breath, holding it for a second before releasing it slowly through my nose. I did not use AI, Mrs. Vanderwall, I said, keeping my voice level, keeping the bass in my chest steady. I wrote every word of this. I can show you the version history. I can show you the timestamps. I can walk you through the logic of the second paragraph where I reference the 1968 critique of automation. She laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, devoid of humor. Version history can be faked, she said, waving her hand dismissively, as if waving away a fly. And anyone can memorize a summary. The software doesn't lie, Marcus. These detectors are sophisticated. They analyze perplexity and burstiness. This text has zero burstiness. It is flat. It is machine-generated. It is perfect. Too perfect for a high school junior. Certainly too perfect for you. There it was. The subtext had finally become the text. Too perfect for you. She didn't mean for a student. She meant for me. She meant that excellence, true, undeniable excellence, was suspicious when it came from my hands. If I had turned in a paper with a few grammatical errors, a few colloquialisms, maybe a chaotic structure, she would have graded it a minus and patted me on the head. She would have been comfortable. My mediocrity would have made her feel safe. But my perfection, my command of the language, that was a threat. That was a glitch in her worldview that had to be patched. And the patch was to accuse me of theft. If she could prove I stole the words, she didn't have to grapple with the fact that I owned them. I looked at the red circle again. It felt like a target. I thought about the app one was building on my laptop at home, the thousands of lines of code I had written over the summer. I thought about the neural networks I was studying, the way I was training a model to recognize patterns in historical data. I knew how these AI detectors worked. I knew they were flawed. I knew they were built on probability, not certainty. They looked for average patterns, and because I had read more books than the average dataset, because I modeled my writing style on Baldwin and Ellison and literal Victorian legal briefs, my writing triggered the algorithm. My literacy was being weaponized against me. The irony was so sharp it almost cut. I was being accused of using a machine by a woman who was acting like one, executing a programmed bias without a single moment of critical thought. I am not going to admit to something I didn't do, I said quietly. Her face hardened. The mask of the concerned educator dropped completely, revealing the bureaucrat underneath. Then you leave me no choice, she said. She reached for the paper, snatching it off the desk with a crinkle. You will receive a 0 on the assignment. I am writing a referral for academic dishonesty. You will serve detention, and this will go on your permanent record. Colleges will see this, Marcus. Do you understand what that means? You are throwing your future away because you were too lazy to do the work yourself. She was trying to scare me. She was trying to use fear to break the deadlock. She wanted me to panic, to beg, to cry. She wanted the power dynamic to be visually confirmed. She wanted me on the defensive. But I didn't feel fear. I felt a cold, crystalline clarity. I looked at the computer on her desk, the glowing monitor where she had likely copy-pasted my essay into a free online detector tool, a tool probably filled with ads and disclaimer text she hadn't read. I thought about the software company that made that tool. I knew them. I knew their API. I knew their CEO's public statements about the limitations of their product. She was using a hammer to perform surgery, and she was blaming the patient for the blood. I stood up. The chair scraped against the linoleum floor, a harsh sound that made 2 students jump. I picked up my backpack. I swung it over one shoulder. I did not look down. I looked her in the eye, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of doubt. Just a microsecond of hesitation. She expected a fight. She didn't expect dignity. May I go to the principal's office now? I asked. She blinked, taken aback by my willingness to escalate. Go, she snapped, pointing at the door. And don't come back until you're ready to be honest. I walked down the aisle between the desks. The walk felt miles long. I could feel the heat radiating from the other bodies in the room. I kept my eyes forward, focusing on the rectangular window in the door, the small square of freedom. I walked past the whiteboard with the date written in blue. I walked past the poster of Einstein that had a quote about imagination being more important than knowledge. As I reached the door, I paused, my hand on the cool metal handle. I turned back. Not to look at the class, but to look at her. She was already moving back to the front of the room, adjusting her blouse, trying to regain the command she felt she had lost. She looked small. Surrounded by books she taught but didn't truly understand, she looked incredibly small. I didn't say anything else. There was nothing left to say to her. The conversation was no longer between a student and a teacher. It was between the past and the future. She was the gatekeeper of a crumbling fortress, trying to keep the gates locked with a key that no longer worked. I was the architect of the new world she was so afraid of. I turned the handle and stepped out into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind me, sealing the noise of the classroom away. The hallway was empty, stretching out in long, polished lines of gray and white. It was quiet. In that silence, my mind began to race, not with panic, but with strategy. She had the grade book. She had the authority. She had the principal's ear. But I had the receipts. I had the raw data. And I knew something she didn't know. I knew that the software company she was citing as the ultimate authority had a public support line. And I knew that if you pushed the right buttons, if you presented the right data, the black box would open. I adjusted my backpack strap. I started walking toward the administrative wing. The war had started in a classroom, but it wasn't going to end there. It was going to end in the cloud. The fluorescent lights hummed a low, electric note that seemed to vibrate against the base of my skull as I navigated the corridor. Every step I took on the linoleum echoed, a sharp percussion against the silence of a school session in full swing. This is the part of the story usually glazed over in the movies. In the films, the hero storms out and immediately finds justice. In reality, there is this long, quiet walk. It is a walk through the valley of administrative limbo. As I moved past the trophy cases and the locked janitorial closets, I felt the weight of something invisible settling onto my shoulders. It was not fear. It was exhaustion. It was a specific type of fatigue known only to those who are required to pay a surcharge simply for existing in spaces that were not designed for them. We call it the black tax. It is not a financial transaction, though it can cost you money. It is an energy transaction. It is the cognitive overhead required to prove you belong in a room you have already entered. It is the requirement to be twice as good to get half the credit, and to be perfectly calm when you have every right to be furious. I stopped for a moment at the water fountain near the gymnasium doors, letting the cold water run over my wrist to slow my pulse. This was the tension of the moment. It wasn't just about a grade on a history paper. It was about the presumption of incompetence. Mrs. Gable did not accuse me of plagiarism because the writing was bad. She accused me because the writing was too good. In her worldview, a student like me, sitting in the back row with a hoodie and a quiet demeanor, could not possibly synthesize complex geopolitical themes without the aid of an algorithm. She looked at my output and saw a machine, because she refused to see the mind. This is the insidious nature of the tax. When my peers use spellcheck or grammar tools, it is called resourcefulness. When they use search engines, it is called research. But when I produce something of high caliber, the immediate assumption is that I must have cheated. The burden of proof shifts instantly. I am not innocent until proven guilty. I am guilty until I can engineer a miracle of evidence. As I dried my hands on my jeans, I realized that this specific accusation regarding artificial intelligence was just the latest software update on an old operating system. 50 years ago, they would have said I copied it from a book. 20 years ago, they would have said I bought the essay online. Today, They say I prompted a chatbot. The mechanism changes, but the underlying logic remains static. The logic dictates that my intellect has a ceiling, and any performance that breaks through that ceiling must be fraudulent. I stared at my reflection in the trophy case glass. I saw a young man who had spent nights coding, reading documentation, and understanding the architecture of language models not to cheat, but to build. I was not a consumer of this technology. I was a creator. And that was the variable she had failed to account for in her equation. She thought she was catching a student cutting corners. She didn't realize she was challenging a developer on his own turf. The hallway stretched out before me, leading toward the administrative wing, the belly of the beast. To survive what was coming next, I knew I had to activate a strategy that had been passed down to me, a sort of cultural inheritance. I call it the trilogy of survival. It is an open loop that I have been refining since I was old enough to understand why security guards followed me in department stores. The first pillar is the defense of excellence. You cannot just be right. You have to be undeniable. Your work must be so airtight, so technically sound, that it repels criticism like water off a raincoat. The second pillar is code switching. This is the ability to speak the language of power better than the people in power. It is about tone, vocabulary, and posture. It is the art of de-escalating a threat by mirroring the authority figure's demeanor until they are disarmed by their own reflection. And the third pillar, the one I was about to deploy with lethal precision, is the receipts. This is the documentation. The raw data. The logs. In the digital age, the truth leaves a footprint. I resumed my walk, the soles of my sneakers squeaking faintly. I needed to get to the principal's office before she did. I needed to control the narrative before it solidified into a disciplinary record. The black tax demands that you are not just a student, but also your own lawyer, your own publicist, and your own character witness. It is a heavy load to carry when you are just trying to get through 11th grade. But as I turned the corner past the library, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. I reached into my pocket and touched the cold aluminum of my phone. Inside that device lay the key to my exoneration. The software company she had cited, the very tool she claimed had flagged my work, had a transparency protocol. I had read their white paper. I knew how the detection probability scores were calculated. I knew the error rates for false positives on complex sentence structures. I knew things about the system that Mrs. Gable didn't even know existed. The entrance to the main office loomed ahead, framed by frosted glass and wooden trim. It looked like a courtroom. In many ways, it was. I paused at the threshold, taking a deep breath, inhaling the scent of old paper and copier toner. This was the moment of tension where the rubber met the road. If I went in there and lost my temper, I would lose the war. If I went in there and played the victim, I would lose the war. I had to go in there as a technician. I had to treat this not as a social conflict, but as a debugging session. There was a glitch in the system. The glitch was a teacher's bias masquerading as academic integrity. My job was to patch the code. I pushed the door open. The receptionist looked up, surprised to see me. I didn't wait to be summoned. I walked over to the waiting bench, sat down, and pulled out my laptop. I wasn't there to wait for punishment. I was setting up my command center. The tax had been levied, but this time, I was refusing to pay. The beige walls of the administrative waiting room were adorned with motivational posters that felt more like ironic jests than genuine encouragement. One featured a kitten hanging from a branch with the caption "Hang in there," while another declared integrity is doing the right thing when no one is watching. I stared at that second poster, tracing the typography with my eyes, dissecting the kerning and the font choice, distracting myself from the pit forming in my stomach. The air conditioning rattled overhead, a mechanical wheeze that punctuated the silence. I had my laptop open on my knees, the screen glowing with the familiar comfort of a dark mode integrated development environment. Lines of Python code cascaded down the display, a waterfall of logic and structure that made infinitely more sense to me than the human drama unfolding behind the heavy oak door to my left. I was not merely waiting. I was reviewing the architecture of my creation. The project in question was not a simple book report or a generic history essay. It was a prototype for a semantic analysis engine, a piece of software designed to interpret intent behind text. The irony was dense enough to choke on. I was being hauled into the principal's office for allegedly using artificial intelligence to write a paper about the ethical implications of artificial intelligence. The teacher, Mrs. Harrow, had flagged my submission not because it was wrong, but because it was right. Specifically, she had circled a paragraph discussing the nuance of neural networks and scribbled a single word in red ink in the margin. Synthetic. That one word erased 3 weeks of sleepless nights. It erased the weekend I spent debugging a recurrent loop in my logic. It erased the pot of coffee I consumed while reading white papers from MIT to understand the underlying math. When the door finally opened, it wasn't the principal who beckoned me, but the school secretary, a woman whose gaze lingered on me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. She called my name as if reading a verdict. I closed the laptop with a deliberate snap, effectively shutting the door on my sanctuary, and stood up. I smoothed the front of my shirt. Presentation mattered. In the theater of systemic bias, appearance was the first line of defense. I walked past the secretary, focusing on my breathing. In through the nose, hold for 4, out through the mouth. This was a technique I learned not from a therapist, but from a tutorial on managing high-pressure server deployments. Keep the system cool. Prevent overheating. The principal's office smelled of stale coffee and floor wax. Principal Skinner sat behind a desk that was too large for the room, creating a physical barrier between authority and subject. Mrs. Harrow sat in a chair to the side, clutching a printout of my paper as if it were evidence from a crime scene. She didn't look at me. She looked at the principal, her lips pressed into a thin, satisfied line. This was the tableau of the defense of excellence. The accused stands alone, armed only with their truth, while the accusers hold the structural power. I took the empty seat without being offered it, placing my laptop bag on the floor next to me. I sat upright, spine aligned, hands folded in my lap. I would not slouch. I would not fidget. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing a nervous child. I was a developer presenting his documentation. Mr. Skinner cleared his throat, shuffling papers. He looked tired, a man caught between the gears of policy and enforcement. He began by talking about academic integrity, about the school's zero-tolerance policy for plagiarism, and the rising tide of automated cheating. He spoke in platitudes, reciting a script I had heard a dozen times in assemblies. I listened, my face a mask of polite interest. Inside, however, my mind was racing. I was cataloging his arguments, identifying the fallacies. He was building a straw man. He was talking about cheating students who copy-pasted Wikipedia articles. He wasn't talking about me. When he finally paused, looking for a sign of contrition, I remained silent. Silence is a powerful variable in any negotiation. It forces the other party to reveal more data. Mrs. Harrow could not handle the silence. She leaned forward, tapping the paper with a manicured fingernail. She said that she had run my paper through 3 different detection tools. She said they all came back with a high probability of AI generation. She said the vocabulary was inconsistent with my previous work. She said the sentence structures were too complex, too rhythmic, too perfect. She used the word perfect like an accusation. This was the core of the issue. The defense of excellence requires one to confront the reality that for some observers, black excellence is indistinguishable from fraud. If I performed at a level of mediocrity, I was invisible. If I performed at a level of genius, I was suspect. There was no middle ground where I could simply be a good student. I looked Mrs. Harrow in the eye. I asked her if she knew what a generative pre-trained transformer actually was. The question hung in the air, unexpected. She blinked, caught off guard. She stammered something about it being a computer program that cheats. I corrected her, gently but firmly. I explained that a transformer model predicts the next token in a sequence based on probability distributions learned from a massive dataset. I explained that these models are designed to mimic human syntax, but they often struggle with genuine novelty or specific, erratic stylistic choices. I told her that my paper was flagged not because it lacked humanity, but because my writing style is highly structured, a result of reading technical documentation rather than fiction. I reached down and unzipped my bag. The movement caused Principal Skinner to tense up, as if I were reaching for a weapon. I pulled out my laptop and placed it on the desk, rotating it so the screen faced them. I told them I wanted to show them something. I didn't wait for permission. I opened the file history of my document. Most students write their essays in a linear fashion, or they copy-paste large blocks of text. The version history of a cheater looks like a sudden manifestation of completed work. My version history looked like a battlefield. It showed the timestamps. It showed the 3 a.m. deletion of an entire paragraph because the thesis wasn't strong enough. It showed the incremental additions, the typos, the corrections, the gradual assembly of an argument over weeks. This is the receipts portion of the defense of excellence. You cannot argue with metadata. I pointed to a specific timestamp. It was a Saturday night, 2 weeks prior. I explained that, at that moment, I was struggling to connect the concept of algorithmic bias to historical redlining. I explained how I had gone to the library to find a specific book on housing discrimination to bridge the gap in my logic. I asked Mrs. Harrow if an AI would go to the library on a Saturday night. I asked her if a chatbot would spend 4 hours rewriting a single transition sentence because the rhythm felt off. Mrs. Harrow did not look at the screen. She crossed her arms, defensive. She said that anyone could fake a document history. She said that smart kids learn how to hide their tracks. This was the shifting goalpost. No amount of proof would be sufficient because the crime wasn't the action, it was the identity of the actor. She wasn't debating the validity of the work, she was debating the validity of my intelligence. It was a closed loop of logic. I was incapable of this work. Therefore the work was stolen. If I proved I didn't steal it, it meant I was still incapable, so I must have stolen it in a way she couldn't detect yet. I felt a cold clarity wash over me. I realized that I wasn't going to win this by playing their game. I couldn't convince her because she didn't want to be convinced. She wanted to be right. She wanted her worldview, in which boys like me did not write sentences like that, to remain intact. To accept my authorship was to accept that she had fundamentally misjudged my potential, and by extension, the potential of every student who looked like me that she had ever taught. That was a psychological weight she refused to carry. So she offloaded it onto me. She made me the anomaly, the liar, the glitch. I turned to Principal Skinner. I decided to pivot. I stopped defending the paper and started defending the code. I told him about the app one was building. I told him that the essay was merely the documentation for a software framework I had already coded. I explained that I was teaching a machine to recognize the very bias that was currently filling the room. I told him that my app analyzes sentiment and detects the subtle linguistic markers of prejudice. I told him that if I ran the transcript of this meeting through my software, it would light up like a Christmas tree. For the first time, the principal looked intrigued. He asked to see the app. Mrs. Harrow scoffed, dismissing it as a distraction, but the principal raised a hand to silence her. He was an administrator, and administrators care about optics and innovation. I opened the terminal. I typed in the command to launch the environment. The black screen filled with green text, scrolling rapidly. It was a visual language that Mrs. Harrow did not speak. It was the language of the future, a language I was fluent in. I showed him the raw code. I walked him through the function definitions. I explained the variables. I spoke with the speed and precision of someone who had built the engine from scratch. I watched the realization dawn on Principal Skinner. He might not have understood the Python syntax, but he understood the passion. He understood that you cannot fake this level of fluency. You cannot pretend to be a native speaker of a language you have never visited. He looked from the screen to me, and for the first time, he saw the student, not the statistic. He saw the hours, the discipline, the sheer intellectual labor that had occurred outside of the classroom. But Mrs. Harrow was not done. She pointed at the screen and said that downloading a script from the internet proves nothing. She said that hacking is just another form of cheating. She was grasping at straws, desperate to maintain the hierarchy. It was a pitiful display, really. A defense of mediocrity against the onslaught of excellence. She was fighting to keep the bar low, because if the bar was high, she might have to actually teach me. She might have to engage with a mind that challenged her own. I closed the laptop again. I had shown the work. I had shown the process. I had shown the receipts. The defense of excellence is not about convincing the hater. It is about fortifying the self. It is about knowing that their doubt is a reflection of their limitations, not yours. I told them that I would not accept a failing grade. I told them that I would not rewrite the paper to make it sound less intelligent. I told them that I would happily take a proctored exam, right now, on the subject matter. I challenged them to test my knowledge, not my format. The room went silent again. The offer was a gamble. It was a direct challenge to their authority. If they accepted, and I passed, they would look foolish. If they refused, they would look unjust. I held my ground. I didn't look down. I didn't apologize. I sat in the silence and let it heavy the air. This was the standoff. The student and the institution. The code and the glitch. I waited for them to make the next move, knowing that I had already won the war inside my own head. I knew who I was. I knew what I had built. And no amount of red ink could delete that. The fluorescent lights of the administrative corridor hummed with a low-frequency buzz that seemed to synchronize with the ringing in my ears as the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me. I stood alone in the hallway, the linoleum floor stretching out in a long, polished gray ribbon that reflected the distorted shapes of lockers and trophy cases. This was the decompression chamber. Inside that office, I had been a gladiator in a suit of armor made of words and logic. Out here, in the vacuum of the empty hallway, the adrenaline began to crystallize into a cold, hard exhaustion. It is a specific type of fatigue known only to those who must constantly curate their humanity to make it palatable for others. I leaned my back against the cool cinder block wall and closed my eyes, visualizing the internal dashboard that I had spent 17 years perfecting. This was the second pillar of my survival, the mechanism that allowed me to walk out of that room a student rather than a suspension statistic. I call it the internal volume knob. Every black boy in America is issued this manual at birth, though the pages are written in the anxious glances of his mother and the stern warnings of his father. We are taught that our presence has a default volume that society perceives as too loud. Our joy is raucous, our silence is ominous, our confidence is arrogance, and our anger is a threat to public safety. To navigate a world that views your baseline existence as an act of aggression, you must become an expert sound engineer of your own soul. You must learn to modulate the gain, adjust the treble, and suppress the bass. Inside the principal's office, when Mrs. Vance had sneered at my vocabulary, insinuating that the word juxtapositional was too complex for a mind like mine to conjure without digital assistance, my internal needle had spiked into the red. The impulse was to shout, to slam my hand on the mahogany desk, to demand respect with the full force of my lungs. That is the natural reaction to insult. It is the human reaction. But I did not have the luxury of being merely human. I had to be a strategist. I remembered the lesson my grandfather taught me on his front porch when I was 10 years old. He told me that a man who cannot control his temper is a man who is easily led by his enemies. He said that if they can make you yell, they have already won, because they have dragged you down to the level where they can beat you with experience. Standing there in the hallway, I replayed the meeting in my mind, analyzing the mix. When Mrs. Vance raised her voice, I lowered mine. When the principal leaned forward with intimidation, I leaned back with contemplation. It was a game of inverse proportions. The internal volume knob isn't about silence, it is about precision. It is about stripping away the noise so that only the signal remains. If I had shouted, they would have focused on my tone. Because I whispered, they were forced to focus on my truth. I pushed off the wall and began walking toward the restroom, needing a moment to wash the tension from my face before returning to the general population of the school. The hallway was empty, class being in session, and my footsteps echoed with a rhythmic clarity. This control, this code switching, is often criticized as inauthenticity. Some say it is wearing a mask. But, as a developer, I see it differently. It is not a mask, it is a user interface. I am the operating system, complex, vast, and capable of processing data at speeds they cannot comprehend. The volume knob is simply the GUI, the graphical user interface, that I present to the user to ensure compatibility. If I run my full kernel in front of Mrs. Vance, her system crashes. She cannot compute a young black man who knows more about large language models than she knows about her own curriculum. So, I offer her a simplified interface. I offer her calm. I offer her polite defiance. I offer her a version of myself that she can process without short-circuiting, even if that version is currently challenging her entire worldview. I pushed open the bathroom door. The air was thick with the smell of cheap soap and damp paper towels. I gripped the porcelain sides of the sink and looked at myself in the mirror. The face staring back was composed, but the eyes were burning. This is the cost of the knob. The energy you suppress doesn't just disappear, it has to go somewhere. It turns inward. It becomes a high-pressure system trapped beneath the skin. This is why our blood pressure is higher. This is why we are tired. We are holding back a tsunami with a picket fence every single day. I splashed cold water on my face, watching the droplets run down my cheeks like digital rain. I thought about the app one was building, the very code that had started this entire witch hunt. My software was designed to detect patterns, to bridge gaps, to translate intent. In a way, I was becoming the software. I was translating my rage into excellence. I was converting the raw data of their prejudice into a structured output of success. I dried my face and adjusted my collar. The proctored exam was scheduled for the next period. They thought this was a punishment. They thought that by stripping me of my laptop, my internet access, and my resources, they would reveal the fraud they so desperately wanted me to be. They didn't understand the nature of the machine they were testing. They thought the intelligence was in the device. They didn't realize the device was just a peripheral. The intelligence was in the chair. I checked the volume knob one last time. I dialed it to a setting I liked to call executive cold. No smiles. No frowns. Just absolute, unshakable neutrality. The kind of silence that makes other people start talking just to fill the void, usually revealing their own insecurities in the process. As I walked back out into the hallway, the bell rang. The doors burst open, and the corridor flooded with the chaos of transition. Students poured out, a river of noise and color, shouting, laughing, slamming lockers. I moved through them like a ghost, untouched by the turbulence. I saw my friends, but I didn't stop. I was in the zone now. I was compiling. The principal and Mrs. Vance were waiting for me in the testing center, armed with their red pens and their skepticism. They were expecting a boy who was scared. They were expecting a boy who was angry. They were about to meet a young man who had mastered the volume of his own existence. They wanted to see if I could write without AI. Fine. I would show them. But I wasn't just going to write an essay. I was going to transcribe the architecture of my mind onto a sheet of loose-leaf paper, and I was going to do it with the deafening loudness of a perfect silence. The door to the testing center clicked shut with a finality that echoed like a cell locking, sealing out the hum of the hallway and leaving me in a vacuum of fluorescent silence. The air inside was cooler than the rest of the school, recycled and smelling faintly of dry erase markers and floor wax, a sterile atmosphere designed to strip away comfort. In the center of the room sat a single wooden desk, scarred by generations of bored students etching initials into the varnish, and upon it lay a stack of pristine-lined paper and 2 blue ballpoint pens. Mrs. Vance stood by the window, her arms crossed over her chest like a barricade, while Principal Higgins sat at a smaller table in the corner, looking less like an administrator and more like a referee at a match he didn't want to oversee. They gestured for me to sit. This was the arena. This was where they expected the facade to crumble. They believed that stripped of my laptop, my Wi-Fi connection, and my supposed algorithmic crutches, I would be revealed as empty. They were waiting for the stutter, the hesitation, the blank stare of a child who had never learned to synthesize a thought without a search engine. I sat down, the wood hard against my back, and picked up the pen. It felt light, almost flimsy, compared to the weighted mechanical keyboard I used at home to build my apps. Mrs. Vance placed the prompt face down on the desk. She slid it toward me with a single finger, as if touching it might contaminate her. "You have 60 minutes, she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "The topic is strictly distinct from your previous assignment to ensure no memorized material can be used. Prove to us this voice is yours." I turned the paper over. The prompt read, "The relevance of historical wisdom in a digital age." The irony was sharp enough to cut glass. They wanted me to write about history and technology while accusing me of abusing the latter and ignoring the former. I stared at the white space below the prompt. To them, that blankness was a void I couldn't fill. To me, it was a canvas. I didn't panic. I didn't sweat. Instead, I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second and left the room entirely. I traveled 3 miles east and 6 years back, to a porch that smelled of pipe tobacco and peppermint tea. I went to see Mr. Davis. If Mrs. Vance was the antagonist of this story, Mr. Davis was the architect of my defense, though he had been gone for 2 years now. He was a retired systems engineer, one of the hidden figures of the mainframe era, a man who had written code on punch cards before touchscreens were even a dream in a science fiction novel. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I used to sit on his porch while he whittled wood and I complained about algebra. He was the one who taught me that coding wasn't just about syntax, it was about logic, and logic was the purest form of language. I remembered a specific afternoon in late autumn, the leaves crunching underfoot, when I had rushed to show him a simple calculator app one had built. I was proud of the interface, the sleek buttons, the way the colors shifted. Mr. Davis had looked at it, nodded slowly, and then set the phone aside. He handed me a notebook and a pencil. "Show me the logic," he had said. I frowned, confused. "It's in the code," I told him. "It works. Just look at the screen." He shook his head, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "The screen is the decoration, son. The code is the engine. But the logic is the blueprint in your mind. If you cannot write the logic out in plain English, if you cannot explain the flow of data from input to output with a pencil, then you do not understand your own creation. You are just a mechanic replacing parts you don't comprehend. You must be an architect." That afternoon, he made me write out the decision tree of my calculator app in prose. He made me describe the variables as if they were characters in a story, and the functions as if they were plot points. He taught me that an essay is nothing more than an algorithm for persuasion. The thesis is your function call. The body paragraphs are your loops, iterating through evidence until the condition of proof is met. The conclusion is your return statement, delivering the calculated result to the user. I opened my eyes in the testing center. Mrs. Vance was watching me, checking her watch, noting the 30 seconds I had spent motionless. She likely thought I was stalling. She thought I was searching for a signal. She didn't realize I had just rebooted my operating system. I gripped the pen. I didn't need ChatGPT. I didn't need a predictive text model. I had the Davis protocol. I started to write. The ink flowed onto the paper, blue and steady. I didn't scribble. My handwriting was a hybrid of cursive and print, efficient and legible, a font developed for speed. I attacked the prompt not with flowery adjectives, but with structural integrity. I began by defining wisdom not as the accumulation of data, but as the ability to discern patterns within that data, a distinction Mr. Davis had drilled into me. I wrote about how the digital age acts as a chaotic input stream, a fire hose of information that requires a filter. That filter, I argued, is historical wisdom. Without the context of the past, the data of the present is just noise. I used the metaphor of a legacy codebase. You cannot patch a bug in the present if you do not understand the documentation of the past. As I wrote, the room around me seemed to expand. The silence wasn't oppressive anymore, it was the quiet of a cathedral or a server room. I was channeling a voice that was older and deeper than my own 14 years. This was the intergenerational link. This was the secret weapon they didn't account for. They looked at a black boy in a hoodie and saw a consumer of content, a user, a statistic. They didn't see the lineage. They didn't see that I was standing on the shoulders of men like Mr. Davis, men who had to be twice as good to get half the credit, men who calculated trajectories for rockets while being denied a seat at the lunch counter. Mr. Davis had prepared me for this exact moment. He had told me, there will come a time, young man, when they will question your competence because it does not fit their narrative of who you are supposed to be. They will say you stole it. They will say you cheated. Do not get angry. Anger is a bug in the system. It causes crashes. Instead, get precise. Precision is undeniable. Excellence is the ultimate firewall. I looked up briefly at the 20-minute mark. Principal Higgins was leaning forward, squinting. He could see the page filling up. He could see the lack of hesitation. There was no writer's block here. There was only data transfer. I was downloading the contents of my mind onto the paper, and the bandwidth was infinite. I moved to my second point, discussing the concept of hallucination in AI. How large language models generate false information because they lack a grounded reality. I contrasted this with the oral tradition of storytelling, where truth is preserved through community verification. I wrote that historical wisdom is the original blockchain, a decentralized ledger of truth kept alive by the elders. It was a sophisticated argument, perhaps too sophisticated for high school, but I didn't care. I wasn't writing for a grade anymore. I was writing for acquittal. I was writing for Mr. Davis. I was writing to prove that my intelligence was not artificial, it was ancestral. The scratching of my pen was the only sound in the room, a rhythmic scratching that sounded like a metronome. Mrs. Vance shifted her weight. She walked past my desk, her eyes darting down to the page. I didn't cover my work. I let her see it. I let her see the vocabulary, the complex sentence structures, the seamless transitions. I wanted her to see it. I wanted her to realize that the software she accused me of using was actually inferior to the hardware I was born with. This was the counter-story. The dominant narrative said that technology made us lazy, that it eroded our cognitive skills. The counter-story, the one I was living, was that for some of us, technology was just a new medium for an old genius. We had been coding in rhythm, in jazz, in civil rights strategies, in survival tactics for centuries. Python and JavaScript were just the newest dialects. I was nearing the conclusion now. My hand was cramping slightly, a physical sensation I rarely felt when typing, but it grounded me. It reminded me that this was labor. This was work. I rounded the corner into the final paragraph, synthesizing the arguments. I wrote that while AI can aggregate human knowledge, it cannot replicate human wisdom, because wisdom requires the risk of living. It requires the possibility of failure. A machine cannot be brave, I wrote, underlining the word brave. It can only be correct or incorrect. But a human, armed with history, can be courageous in the face of the unknown. I put the period at the end of the final sentence. It was a hard dot, pressing deep into the fibers of the paper. I sat back. I had 10 minutes to spare. I didn't proofread. I didn't need to. The code had compiled without errors. I looked at Mrs. Vance. She wasn't looking at the paper. She was looking at me, and for the first time, the smugness was gone, replaced by a confusion that looked suspiciously like fear. She was realizing that she had miscalculated the variables. She had opened a box she couldn't close. I capped the pen. The click was loud. I slid the paper toward the center of the desk, perfectly aligned with the edges. I stood up. The ghost of Mr. Davis stood with me, adjusting his glasses, nodding his approval. I had shown the work. I had drawn the logic. I had proven that the ghost in the machine was me. The morning sun hit the linoleum of the administrative corridor with a harsh interrogative glare that seemed to strip the color from the walls. I sat on a wooden bench that had been polished by the nervous shifting of 1,000 students before me. My mother sat to my right, her posture a masterpiece of architectural spine, radiating a silence that was louder than any shout. My father sat to my left, holding a leather portfolio on his lap as if it were a shield. We were not there to plead. We were not there to beg for a second chance or to offer an apology for a transgression I did not commit. We were there to audit the system. The summons had come the previous evening, hours after I had submitted the handwritten proof in Mrs. Vance's classroom. The school board, represented by Principal Halloway and a district adjudicator, wanted to settle the matter of academic integrity before the semester grades were locked. They expected a confession. What they were about to receive was a foreclosure on their assumptions. Principal Halloway opened the door, his face arranged in a mask of practiced neutrality that fooled no one. He ushered us into the conference room, a space dominated by a long mahogany table that smelled of lemon oil and stagnation. Mrs. Vance was already seated at the far end. She did not look up as we entered. She was busy arranging a stack of papers with the precise, jittery movements of someone trying to build a fortress out of straw. On the table between us lay the handwritten essay I had produced under her supervision, and next to it, her laptop, open and glowing like a watchful eye. The adjudicator, a man named Mr. Henderson who wore a suit that seemed 2 sizes too large for his spirit, cleared his throat. He began with the standard preamble about zero tolerance and the sanctity of the grading curve. I listened, letting the words wash over me like static. I was watching Mrs. Vance. She was tapping her finger against the edge of the table, a rhythmic ticking that betrayed her anxiety. She knew the handwritten test was perfect. She knew the logic held. But she had found a new angle, a desperate pivot to save her narrative. Mrs. Vance finally spoke, her voice thin and reedy. She claimed that while the handwritten test demonstrated memory, it did not disprove the original accusation. She argued that I could have simply memorized the output of a generative AI engine, regurgitating it onto the paper to mock the disciplinary process. It was a shifting of the goalposts so rapid it was almost impressive. She was suggesting that my mind was empty, a mere vessel for a machine's hallucination, denying me even the agency of my own memory. She produced a printout from a plagiarism detection software, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. It showed a probability score of 90%. She laid it down like a trump card. The room went silent. My mother shifted, ready to speak, but I placed a hand on her arm. This was the moment I had prepared for. This was the trap I had let them walk into. I reached into my father's leather portfolio and pulled out my own stack of documents. They were bound in a simple black clip. I slid them across the mahogany surface, the sound of paper on wood cutting through the tension. I explained that I was aware of how these detection models worked. They looked for perplexity and burstiness, statistical patterns that supposedly differentiated human syntax from machine generation. But I also knew their flaw. They were biased against non-standard dialects and, more importantly, they were biased against high-level, formal writing from demographics they did not associate with academic excellence. I told them that I had not just written an essay, I had engineered a defense. But that was not the primary evidence. The primary evidence was the metadata. I opened my laptop, which I had been allowed to bring for my defense, and projected my screen onto the wall monitor. I didn't show the essay. I showed the version history. I walked them through the timestamps of the original digital assignment. I showed the keystroke dynamics logs I had installed on my own machine months ago, a habit I picked up from coding forums to track my typing efficiency. The logs showed the pauses, the backspaces, the restructuring of sentences in real time. A large language model generates text in linear bursts. Humans generate text in loops. We write, we delete, we pause to think, we rewrite. The data visualization on the screen showed the chaotic, messy, beautiful struggle of human thought. It showed me wrestling with the thesis statement for 20 minutes. It showed the deletion of 3 paragraphs at 2 a.m. It showed the human cost of the work. Mr. Henderson leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he tried to parse the graph. It was irrefutable proof of process. But Mrs. Vance shook her head, dismissing the technical data as something I could have spoofed. She was digging in. She needed to be right more than she needed to be just. That was when I played the final card. I reached back into the portfolio and withdrew a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored stationery. It bore the letterhead of Cognitron Labs, the very software company whose detection tool Mrs. Vance had used to accuse me. The silence in the room changed frequency. It became heavy, pressurized. I explained that 3 days ago, when the accusation was first levied, I had sent a query to the company's support team. I had included my essay and the teacher's accusation. But being a developer, I had also sent a request for a forensic audit of the query logs associated with the school's enterprise account. I wanted to know how the test was run. The letter I held was from the Chief Technical Officer of Cognitron. It was not a form letter.